Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Psychedelics Today live stream. I'm here today with David Glowacki from Intangible Realities Laboratories. He's a researcher, artist, and scientist, and I'm really excited to have him on. We had a good time chatting at Penn at the recent Philadelphia conference. I think it was in the fall. And yeah, it's been longer than I expected for us to catch up, but I'm glad we're here.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks for
It's
joining
good
me.
to see you.
Yeah, likewise. And where in the world are you joining us from today?
I'm in Portugal right now. Have like a art studio space, music making space that I come and spend time in the north part of Portugal in the woods at the side of a river. It's really nice.
Yeah, that's gorgeous. Cool. So, you, I think, came onto my radar in a real way, only at Penn, but I do remember hearing things about your work before that, but I never really kind of leaned in. And the one project that um, I'm most aware of is Clear Light. Is that what it's called? The VR tool?
Yeah, the tool is called Anuma. Um, the software, the app itself is called Anuma. But then there's a number of experiences that we've designed using Anuma. Uh, the the experience that kind of got the most press after we published a few papers about it over the last few years was an experience called isness. And that paper we showed with that experience, it got a lot of press because we published papers showing that when we gave people this group VR experience, that they scored like similar scores on the psychometrics that are used to evaluate um, psychedelics, like the MEQ30 questionnaire and a few other questionnaires that are often used by researchers to evaluate psychedelics. And so when we rolled out this experience isness, we showed that we pretty consistently got comparable scores. And so that shocked a lot of people because, I think a lot of people thought, well, psychedelics are special in being able to produce these kinds of scores. I'm not saying that VR that we make is exactly like psychedelics at all. It's a different kind of thing. But the fact is that at least in terms of how people rate it on these scales that are used, it's touching some kind of common threads. And so that generated a lot of interest because I think it was just surprising to people that something like virtual reality in a group setting would be able to do that. And then more recently, we've started another project called Clearlight, which you mentioned, where we're developing sort of forms of VR facilitated forms of group therapy to let people kind of meditate on their mortality. So people that have maybe received like a terminal diagnosis for cancer or something like that. Using it as kind of these are people that often, you know, if you have a cancer diagnosis, maybe you're already on a lot of medications and things like this. So psychedelics aren't always the best idea. Obviously, there's the stigma attached to them. So psychedelics are great. They're not for everybody. And I think, there's some space for the kind of things we're doing for end of life care where we hope to maybe highlight some use for the virtual reality as a form of group therapy.
Mm, yeah, I love that. Um, Cool. And let's kind of rewind the tape. Like you have a deep interest in your death experience. And I think I shared with you that my co-founder at Psychedelics Day had a pretty intense near-death experience at age 15 or so. Kind of had a pretty intense snowboarding accident. And, was moments away from being unrecoverable, but he recovered. And that sent him on a really interesting mission for the rest of his life. And it seems like um, maybe there's something there like that for you. Could you share a little bit about what kind of precipitated your interest in NDEs?
Yeah, so in 2006, I had um, a hiking accident in the mountains where I basically like freak kind of thing, but I I fell like 30 meters really high. And uh, I, when I hit the ground, like the sort of that acute moment, I mean, my body was shattered, like both arms shattered, hip
Mm,
shattered, vertebrae shattered, ribs shattered. So I was lacerations over my whole body. Um,
mm,
and, but in that several hours after impact on the floor, um, I basically, as I was waiting to be rescued, um, my lungs were filling with blood because the force of the impact was so strong. And so I was suffocating. And so I was like, every breath just became like this huge labor, um, you know. And so, yeah, I thought for that period that, oh, I was basically making the transition into the next sort of state of whatever
mm,
whatever comes next. And you know, I had this experience where I separated from my body, and I just perceived myself as just a very faintly pulsing light. Everything was just sort of everything was light. There was no real structure, and I could see my body as this pulsing light, and as I would inhale it would get a little bit brighter, and as I would exhale it would get a bit dimmer. And but in general, like the like the envelope of the oscillation was getting smaller and smaller. And I kind of knew that when that light was no longer visible, that would be the end of like this physical body. um, but there was no fear or anything associated with it. There was like this deep sense of peace and transcendence and curiosity, and really a deep sense of rest, actually. Like, um,
mm.
so yeah, I was actually really disappointed when I woke up in the hospital, all connected to pipes, tubes, and in incredible amounts of pain. But yeah, that experience, yeah, has played quite an important role in a lot of the art that I make these days, and also the work we're doing in virtual reality, and thinking about how to capture the phenomenology of that experience and offer it to people as a kind of um, I mean, when I think about it now, because my PhD is in computational physics. One of the things I studied was quantum mechanics, and quantum mechanics. Like, we don't have to get into it now, but there's one important idea in quantum mechanics is that there's two ways of describing things, and they're equally valid ways. You can describe things on the one hand as like particles, as matter, and then on the other hand, you can describe stuff as energy waves. And sometimes one description is a good way to do it, and sometimes another description is a good way to do it. Depends what you're looking at. This is often, maybe you've heard the particle wave duality, right? It's this two different ways of describing things. One is a more sort of classical material way of describing things. Another is a more sort of delocalized energetic way of describing things. And
I love the
so
term wavicle
wavical,
for that.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
another way that you can talk about it. Yeah. And so seeing myself as energy was interesting with my sort of physics training, because it's what we teach. So for me, I really see the experiences we're offering as a way for people to kind of just contemplate, yeah, the relationship between the material world and the energetic world.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that. Um, it's interesting to have that experience. I just saw Robin Carhart Harris yesterday uh, say that we are light beings on his Twitter page, which I found interesting for somebody like Robin to be using that language. But he was kind of pointing at the like very low level kind of photon emissions from our bodies that kind of support that. Um,
Hmm.
and I found that interesting. Anyway,
Hmm.
but yeah, this kind of like challenging nature of these experiences that kind of force us to encounter and face like these new weird ways of thinking, like this, who am I now that I had this experience, and like, am I the same? Kind of, but also you had this new experience that makes you something new and a new way of kind of thinking about yourself. Yeah. So have
Mm.
you dug into a lot of the near death experience literature after your experience?
Little by little, I have. Yeah, I mean,
Hmm.
my, like I said, my PhD was more in sort of hardcore computational physics stuff. But as
Hmm.
I've started doing this work, and as I've kind of talked more about the origins of where it comes from and my own NDE, a lot of people have started sharing with me more about the literature, and then I've started reading more myself. And yeah, I guess, I mean, I've started getting much more interested in this kind of phenomenology that people report during near death experiences, and interestingly finding that my own experiencing myself and my body as light is not altogether uncommon. I wouldn't say it's the most common thing people experience if you just kind of do a statistical analysis of the literature, but it's by no means unheard of. Like, it's definitely something that seems like a lot of people have encountered. And also from a more contemplative perspective, um, maybe you've heard of the bardos, right? The Buddhism, the bardos are like transition points, and so it literally just means transition. And so, like, the sort of first bardo following residence in the human body is often called the bardo of luminosity. And so it was interesting that
Mm.
my phenomenological experience mapped into, this other more ancient way of describing these phenomenologies, which also aligns with what other people experience. And so, yeah, I sincerely believe that a sizable number of people will encounter something like that when they reach that transition. Maybe not everybody, but a lot. And so, why not get comfortable with it now?
Right. And like there's literature that suggests that this is a relatively ancient practice, getting comfortable with dying, beyond Tibetan Buddhism and what was
Hmm.
documented there. Like this is, not dissimilar to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is more like, hey, I'm living here so that I can do well in what's after. I think they called it the duat. And then, similarly in some Greek traditions, it's like dying before dying makes me
Hmm.
unafraid of death, so
Hmm.
I can really be here. Um, one one thing I got a kick out of recently, and it's like mysticism as a challenge to authoritarianism. It's like mystics are kind of like resilient to authoritarianism in that we're
Mm.
not as afraid of these threats as a lot of normal folks. Like if you haven't
Mm.
had these like transcendent experiences, you're like,
Mm.
oh, all I am is this, and this is all I have, so therefore I don't want to risk it. When it's like, well,
Mm.
things perhaps are a little bit more eternal than that.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I yeah, I mean, in the same vein where, like, if you talk about mysticism as a site of resistance, I like that. Um, the sacred also is like a resistance against capitalism. By definition, something sacred cannot be commodified, right? And so there's another interesting point of resistance, which is like things that are sacred as sites of resistance against capitalism, which is something I've become very interested in over the years, which I think is like a similar kind of relationship as what you're kind of hinting at with mysticism and authoritarianism. Just fear in general. I mean, authoritarians create fear, and the mystic is just probably less prone to whatever form of fear arises, right? I mean, that's the thing about death is like, when you're little, you're like, well, what's the worst thing could happen to you? Well, you're gonna die. Well, I mean, of course that's gonna happen. So we all know that's the worst possible thing, right? So once once you don't fear that, um, then that's it's a position of, yeah, being able to operate in a way that is distinct from how a lot of people operate. I mean, this is one of the story about how Zen came to prominence. Zen Buddhism in Japan was, they basically, the Zen monks went up to the daimyos in the hills outside, outside Kyoto or wherever, and you know, like the only thing they could show, the daimyos were like, why aren't these guys afraid of us? We want to learn what they have, right? Because they're not afraid of us. Like everyone else is afraid of us except these guys. And you threaten to kill them, and the guy says, I'm not afraid. And you can't actually kill him, because if you kill him, you'll never know if he was afraid or not, right? So there's this really interesting tension there, right? Where and then
Hmm.
eventually, the daimyo started offering up their wealth and their artistry and their land to the Zen monks, and to learn why they weren't afraid. So there's a lot to be said for that.
So let's talk a little bit about I think the thing that so working with some of these VR applications with terminally ill folks, like not everybody's able to consume psychedelics. Like you said earlier, psychedelics aren't for everybody, and they're certainly not for everybody at every moment in their life, right? So, like,
Hmm.
if you're in
Yeah.
a terminal situation, it's not necessarily the case that that's the most amazing time to administer psychedelics. So,
Hmm.
things like a VR tool or other kind of wearables might actually be more appropriate than psychedelics. So you were doing some investigation into this. Could you talk a little bit about what you were doing there?
Yeah, sure. Just want to make one more point about what you said about dying before you die and things like this. I mean, ayahuasca means vine of the souls, right? So I mean, it's like the one of the ideas around ayahuasca has been that it's a kind of death simulator. So it's not just within mystical traditions, even within the psychedelic tradition, there's some um, the the there's resonance there in terms of
Yeah.
the psychedelic experience mimicking a kind of certain kind of death experience. And I should say, actually, as probably one of the few people that's had many psychedelic experiences and a near death experience, is that my ayahuasca, I mean, I lived in Peru for almost 2 years and had an ayahuasca center and was cooking medicine in the jungle and doing the whole living with an ayahuasca down there. Took ayahuasca a lot of times. um, and my ayahuasca phenomenologies were never anything like my near death phenomenology. Wildly, wildly different. So, some similarities certainly in terms of like the sense of continuity of self with the environment, but the phenomenology was wildly distinct. The ayahuasca was much more luminous and vibratory than what I experienced during my NDE. So then, anyway, just wanted to say that because I think that is interesting in the context of a Psychedelics Today podcast. But yeah, the question you asked me was about the work we're doing. Repeat the question you asked me again.
So
Sorry.
I'm just curious to have you kind of share about the research that was published on the using your VR platform with people with life-threatening illnesses and like,
Yeah.
the importance of that, what kind of stuff you saw beyond, yes, there was some like MEQ scores that were surprisingly high, but like what
Mhm.
what is the software? Why were you doing it with this population? And,
Mhm.
what did you see?
Yeah. So we published a pilot study last year, using a program called Clearlight, which is kind of designed as a contemplation on mortality, really a contemplation on the relationship between matter and energy, and um, getting people comfortable with the sense of their material body dissolving. I mean, really, that's really what it's about. And so we offered this as a experience to people that um, had, life-threatening illnesses, and who had anxiety in relationship to that. And it was offered through a company that's spun out of my lab called Enuma. Was the kind of structure that made this possible, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done for supporting these kinds of populations and things. And to create the Clearlight program, it was basically four like half-hour VR sessions over a space of 2 weeks. So people go in, VR 4 times over a space of 2 weeks for about 30 minutes. And then it's sort of bookended by a Zoom call at the start with the group, and then a Zoom call at the end with the group. And I mean, what we did in terms of the research was we kind of just followed what the psychiatric literature does. They have a set of questionnaires that they use to pre and post to like get people to self-assess, like where they're at before they do the intervention, and then where they're at after the intervention. And then you're looking at a whole host of like things related to their levels of anxiety and their level of stress and how much meaning they have associated with their life and all these things. And yeah, when we did that with this program, it was a small pilot study, so this was not a large scale trial of the sort that would need to be run in order to really anchor this, but it was a starting place, and it's where we started. And the results that we got from the pilot were incredibly encouraging. I mean, I'm pretty much 6 of the 7 scales that we saw statistically significant reductions in sort of negative emotions associated with death, and with quite large effect sizes, actually. So really excited about that as an alternative to psychedelics for people at that stage. And I think one of the things that we encountered a lot, the biggest, we quite consistently got feedback from people who finished this 2-week course with a cohort of people that were in a similar situation with them, right? So it's basically like a kind of VR facilitated group therapy, I guess you could say. And one of the most consistent pieces of feedback we got was that many people who participated felt like they wanted to go deeper. Like they felt like we had opened a door for this conversation to occur in a culture that mostly represses this kind of conversation from happening at all. Like capitalism, in my opinion, is quite bad at dealing with anything that challenges the idea of infinite growth, forever more everything growing all the time. So our culture is not so good at creating space for that until the very last second, and then it feels all kind of rushed. And so the fact that we were creating a space for people, allowing them to go into this thing that's often repressed, a lot of people seem to find really beneficial. And we were a small team with limited resources, so when it finished, we had to kind of be like, okay, it's done now. But certainly, I think we were, we were quite encouraged by the level of interest that we were seeing from the folks who participated about wanting to go deeper in these things, which was really interesting.
Um, and what kind of interesting attention came from you publishing this? Like, did you find some interesting allies or new colleagues?
Yeah, so on the heels of the work that we've been doing, we, this preliminary work enabled us to make a grant proposal to a fund called the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation, which is kind of supporting, which was started by a woman called Elizabeth Koch, she's interested in funding transformational neuroscience against certain areas of interest. And we made a grant proposal to kind of, with these preliminary results in place that we'd obtained, and said, we think these results are really encouraging. It would be great to do this at a larger scale with more people in a more rigorous way, with a bit more resource behind it, in order to, see whether these results are reliable, and also to try and optimize it to make sure that it's better tailored to, address the sort of fears and anxieties that, a lot of people are very real for a lot of people around death. And so we put together that proposal, and we were notified that we were successful in getting that, which was very excellent. And so now we're about just under a year into that research project, which we're starting. My lab is based in the north of Spain in Santiago de Compostela. And so we're about, we've started doing that work now. And so we've started optimizing the experiences, and soon we'll start a larger randomized control trial. And we're collaborating with the University Hospital in Spain to, trying to work with oncologists to get them to potentially refer, patients who are suffering anxiety to go through this program. And that's all in progress right now. So hopefully we'll
That's
have some
beautiful.
good results to report quite soon, but it feels like quite meaningful work, and a lot of people seem really excited about it. And it's been interesting running it in Spain versus the US. We've definitely noticed cultural differences. We've had to translate everything from English into Spanish, which is, there's never a direct one-to-one translation for anything. And so that's been an interesting piece of work. And then finding cultural differences that are relevant, which we've had to address and think about, which has been fascinating. But on the whole, things seem to be going quite well.
Yeah, brilliant. Um, so are there, do you think, distinct advantages in terms of researching VR over psychedelics? Like it seems like with there not being drugs in place, it would be a lot easier to implement research. Is that track?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely true. Getting approval for a VR, you still have to get, human subjects approval and all that kind of stuff, and go through institutional review boards and whatnot if you're doing any kind of human subjects testing. But not having to get drug licenses does mean that at least that part's easier. But what you do have to do is build compelling VR content that people like, and that's not so easy. So um, we, I guess one of the things about psychedelics is you give people a drug and then stuff happens. And as you know, set and setting is important, and you can guide to a certain extent what people's experience is during a psychedelic treatment. But you can't, that that's quite, it's still, there's a lot of the, it's not exact what's going to happen. There's like a wide probability space for what people might encounter, even if you do the best you can to curate the set and the setting. And so, well, I guess mostly you're curating the setting, not the set. The set so
Hmm.
much, I guess, as comes with the person. But you can curate the setting as much as you want, but there's still a lot of variability. And so, for scientific study, what's interesting about VR is that, when you want to understand things scientifically, it generally helps to be able to have more control over the variables that you can tweak. The more control, the more precise statements you can make, right? So
Hmm.
that's just how science, the less control you have over your variables, the less precise statements you can make. That's the scientific method. So one thing about VR that's quite interesting is that, we have a high degree of we know what the phenomenology is that people are experiencing in a VR environment. Um, and so, we can, you can get quite precise about things. You can really dive into quite specific details about, well, changing this representation seems to affect things in that direction, and if we change things in this way, it maybe makes things go in some other direction. And so this is quite it's quite interesting. And in our original paper, where we showed that people scored kind of the same on psychometrics with VR as with psychedelic drugs, was really interesting. I mean, it went viral, that paper, especially after like Joe Rogan mentioned it on his podcast in conversation with Rick Strassman. Um, but it also got a lot of kickback. Like, a lot of people were not happy about the paper because they felt like we were claiming that virtual reality was a substitute for psychedelic drugs, which definitely I'm not claiming that. It's definitely different. Um, but it does get to an important question, which is like, maybe it was just highlighting the fact that it was highlighting limitations in the psychometrics. I mean, that's one possibility. But also, I think, there's a little bit of arrogance in the psychedelic community sometimes, that like psychedelics are the only way to create a certain kind of experience. And so I think some people got upset that, you know, we were showing, well, there's this other technologically mediated way for doing this. But what's interesting to me is that, originally, when, psychedelic mystical experience was being studied back in the 50s or 60s, was actually
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people who were like from a religious tradition, who were maybe meditators or whatever, were criticizing psychedelics as being the shortcut to getting to that experience, right? And now VR comes along, and the psychedelics people are criticizing as maybe VR is a shortcut to get to that experience. So everyone always wants to protect their experiential fidelity, right? Like, I want to have my experience be the authentic experience, right? For me, I don't think I'm too precious about it. I think that we know certain things about what a psychedelic experience is like phenomenologically, and some of that stuff can be recreated in with careful design in VR, and it appears to have an important effect on people. And there's been a lot of work recently by people who are interested in how important the visual component of the trip is. A lot of the models in psychedelic science at the moment see the visual stuff as just an epiphenomenon of brain dynamics. So it's kind of like you drink a molecule, it goes to your brain, it does something, and then visual effects happen because of what's happening at the top level brain dynamics. But it turns out that your visual system actually has a lot of HT2A receptors, which are the psychedelic, um, which we know that psychedelics interact with. And so there's been some interesting speculation recently as to whether the visual component of a trip is actually really, really, like, potentially equally as important as the top level brain dynamics. And so what's interesting from a VR perspective is that if that's true, that the visual component isn't just a byproduct of top level brain dynamics, but actually plays a more fundamental role in the trip, then that means that, like, clever design can potentially go part way toward bringing you into a psychedelic like state, potentially. Again, that's an ongoing research question. But certainly there are artworks that you see that you can bring you to a state where you feel like, whoa, what's going on here? I mean, we've all probably seen artworks like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this kind of pushback. Like, you're trying to replace the psychedelic experience with this, and like, No. Like I'm sure some people are trying to do that, but like that's not really possible, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I'm definitely not trying to do that. I see all these things as tool set, like I, you know, contemplative practice, psychedelic practice, technological practice. I mean, they're sometimes good for certain situations, and don't be too precious about, yeah, any one of them.
right, right. There's tools, there's paths, there's room for novelty here too. Like bringing new
Hmm.
tech into old traditions is totally something that's
Hmm.
happened historically plenty of times, and it's happening again now. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, I think like um, I find it fascinating when Buddhist monks will start experimenting with psychedelics on a somewhat regular basis to improve their practice, and I
Hmm.
find that amazing. I wouldn't be surprised if there was people using all sorts of wearables and VR tools to also improve their practice in the
Hmm.
Tibetan traditions or whatever tradition it
Hmm.
is, right? Yeah, and then
Yeah.
to add a little bit of nuance and flair, like it's clear that somebody with 20 to 40 years of practice in one of these traditions is going to have a slightly different experience than somebody who hasn't really done any real spiritual experience or practice of any kind. But like, why is that meaningful? I don't know. Like, we're talking about very
Wait,
different things.
what do you mean? Somebody who has like a contemplative practice for 20 or 40 years, you mean?
So let's do a really specific example. So say like high level Vajrayana leader,
Hmm.
40 years into their career, they start experimenting with things like these VR tools and or psychedelic molecules. I think there will be some subjective differences in what presents and how they
Yeah.
interpret that based on all of their priming, right? And
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
I'm not saying the LSD experience is necessarily different for them, but
Hmm.
it's different for everybody, right? Like it's
Hmm.
no two bodies are the same, no two sets are the same. So like
Hmm.
I think there's going to be different stuff expressing, but it's still like the LSD experience. And I think similarly we'd say the VR experience, like to your point, it's a very controlled thing we can present. So they're getting the same thing, but what comes from that might be a little bit different. So like
Yeah.
there's differences, but like, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about, oh, you're not so spiritual, or like your experience doesn't matter because you don't have a practice of some kind? But like,
Hmm.
I don't know. Like I think people just got to chill out a little bit on these things.
Well, I mean, you're talking about set basically, right? So, like,
Hmm.
certainly the set of somebody who's been a contemplative teacher for 30 years or something is going to be quite different than someone who sits like scrolling on Instagram most nights, right? So, like, for sure, um, definitely different sets. That's definitely going to create a different response. We've
Yeah.
had really, really great responses with people from Buddhist, specifically Vajrayana traditions, actually, who have experienced a lot of the stuff that we're doing,
Hmm.
and who have actually expressly said this would be a really great way to train people in meditation. And meditation, a lot, not all meditation is just sitting and thinking about your breath with your eyes closed. That's a certain
Right.
form of mindfulness meditation that's become very popular in the West, and it's great, and like it's totally a great practice. But there's a lot of other forms of practices that involve more other kinds of visualizations, and for learning those visualizations, like anything that's abstract, is you have to construct a mental model of what it's like, and people that are good at doing that are tend to these meditation practices tend to be good at constructing that mental model, just like if you're learning abstract physics or something. Like, I give you a set of equations, and then you have to turn that set of equations into a representation in your mind, and good students in physics are able to do this, and people that struggle aren't able to do this so well. And that sort of psychological internal visualization process is really important. And so when I think about teaching contemplative practice with some of these technologies, it's very similar to that kind of an analogy. It's like, well, these are tools that can offer people a mental model. So if you're not good at visualizing, look, I just helped you create a visualization. Now you don't have to go into VR every single time you need to return back to that visualization, but now that I've given it to you, you have a residue of it, which you can kind of go back to. And so we've had a lot of interest from actually like quite high level meditation teachers and in the Buddhist tradition asking us about the potential of using these tools for training when they've seen them, which has been interesting.
I love that. So I have two things I want to go into. So number one, this concept of like aphantasia, and then part two, the story you were telling me a while ago about showing a top tier neuroscientists how molecules bind to
Hmm.
receptor sites in the VR tool. So
Hmm.
first, with aphantasia, like aphantasia being the inability to actually like visualize, and I think there's a
Hmm.
spectrum of subject of
Yeah.
like that, and I have it
Yeah.
to a degree, and I've had like an interesting run with psychedelics where like very often I get zero visuals of
Hmm.
any kind, like even visual distortions, like they like just started showing up really last weekend.
Hmm.
But like I think um, I had one accident with like roughly 20 hits of LSD, and there's plenty of visuals there, but like that's really pushing the limits of what people should be consuming. And
Hmm.
again, an accident to everybody, but that was
Hmm.
fascinating for me because people are talking about just how much everything's moving, and I'm like, I don't
Hmm.
like certainly inside me, but like not
Hmm.
outside. And I wonder if there's a link with aphantasia there. And then secondly, I
Hmm.
wonder about the trainability of aphantasia. Like, could we use these kinds of tools to like and maybe with like microdosing or something to improve someone's ability to visualize. Like you said, let's give you a
Yeah.
representation and see if you can practice that without the headset.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting what you're talking about. We've definitely had people in the VR, in our VR system. We call this VR, by the way, we call it pneumodelic VR to distinguish it from psychedelics because it's not psychedelics, it's a different thing. Um, and so I coined this term just to make it clear that I'm not trying to replicate psychedelics. It's this other thing, but there's some crossovers, hence the word pneumodelic. Um, and yeah, we've had people in the pneumodelic VR environment who are self-described as aphantasia in the sense that they don't get very very strong visual components from their trips, and they don't. Um, these people often, for yeah, they. I don't know what to say. It's an interesting question. It's an open
Yeah.
question. I think like the extent.
And we'd want to add a little distinction between like the psychedelic visual component and then also like picture a chalkboard and you do a simple math equation on it. Like
Right.
I think they're two distinct things too, but I haven't seen much work on it.
Are you someone that cannot visualize like even if I say picture an apple in your head, you can't like picture an apple and kind of turn it around?
Like, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
You
I've done a
cannot
couple
do that.
like small inventories on this and like
Okay.
um yeah. But yeah, it's like and I'm not on the severe end. Like I think I can do it
Hmm.
a little bit, little bit, but then I hear what other people are doing. I'm like, that's outrageous. Like
Yeah.
I would kind of like that, but also I wonder if it's kind of like protective too. Like in that if I saw something really horrifying, I don't have to like see it all the time, you know?
I wonder. I mean, I wonder. An open question is: would people with
Hmm.
aphantasia respond to VR at all? Like, I
That
guess
would be a
that's a
cool
because
study.
it's a visual experience. So, like, I mean, you're saying
Hmm.
maybe it could be used to help people with aphantasia, but it's like maybe it's a technology that just doesn't. I don't know. I actually have no
Yeah.
idea. Maybe
Hmm.
they would just not be responsive to it because it's basically a visual technology. It's an audio visual technology, right? There's a few other perceptual affordances in VR that we play with. So we play with a sense of proprioception. So um, proprioception is kind of like if you close your eyes, you can touch your nose basically, right? So, because you have a whole bunch of sensors in your body that are basically spatially locating the positions of your limbs, even when your eyes are closed, right? And so most people can like touch their nose even with their eyes are closed, or if you know where your hands are, even when your eyes are closed, roughly you have a sense of proximity sensors of what your orientation is. Um, and so you can play with that in VR, and we've done a lot of studies playing with a sense of proprioception in VR, which is really fascinating. But you have me thinking maybe people that had severe aphantasia or even slight aphantasia might not respond to that as a kind of technology. I don't know.
Yeah, that'd be fascinating to look at. And then secondly, let's chat about this. You had a story. I don't know what's public and what isn't, but you showed this famous neuroscientist a psychedelic molecule binding to a receptor site in VR to help
Mhm.
kind of actually add some sort of, I don't know, better modeling for how these things work for him. Could you
This well,
speak a
this
little
was
bit about
actually
that?
this was Robin Carhart Harris when he visited our lab in oh pre-COVID, maybe that was, yeah,
Mm,
2019 maybe. One of the things I showed him was um, I showed him in VR. Actually, it was him and Chris Timmerman, who's another psychedelic
hmm
researcher, who's a friend of mine who's done a lot of stuff in DMT space. Um, I put them both into VR, and then we all kind of went into VR, and we were able to visualize the structure of LSD bound to the human HT2B serotonin receptor. So at the time in 2019, there was no structure that was had been measured for LSD bound to HT2A. I believe now there is. That was published a few years ago. So if Robin was to come back, now I could show him LSD bound to HT2A, human serotonin receptor. But yeah, a lot of the VR work that we've done has its roots in my sort of chemical physics origins, my molecular physics kind of background, where we study the physics of how molecules work, how they move, and what they do. And so the entire molecular world is wiggling and jiggling and moving all the time. It's not these static molecules that you learn about in high school. It's like dynamic and moving and really beautiful. And um, the VR tools that we've developed in my lab, which have been spun out into this sort of pneumodelic VR, have the origin of that work is actually using VR to visualize the dynamics of molecules at the level of atoms. And we developed a technology called NanoVer, which is a VR app. So nano is, well, nano's like nanoscience. It's like about the size of an atom.
hmm
And then ver in Spanish, ver means to see. So the the app we made, the VR app, is called NanoVer. It allows you to see the nanoscale, and it's technology that like literally lets you reach out and touch and manipulate the physics of molecules that are being
Mm,
simulated in real time using the kind of power of cloud computing and VR. And so we are using that tool for a whole bunch of applications, looking at a whole bunch of different sort of molecular systems. And that's kind of the root of the tree from which the other applications have grown. And so when Robin came to the lab, I just thought, because he comes more from a psychiatry kind of psychology background, um, I thought it'd be cool to show him the sort of structure in all of its atomic detail of what these things look like. And so
mm,
we cooked up a simulation for him to see um, the LSD bound to the receptor and then embedded in the membrane of the cell. So the HC2B receptor and the 2A receptor are embedded in the wall of a cell, the membrane. And so it was a very cool thing that we were able to show him when he came. I think it left a lasting impression.
yeah. Yeah, I bet. Um, Now, like, do you have any concept? like back to the I only know about the clear light kind of part of the software and the clear, and like this idea of us having kind of a soft boundary of who we are
Hmm.
instead of like a feeling of like a firm boundary of who we are. And
Hmm.
like how do you like to kind of model that story of like, oh, now we have soft boundaries and we can actually merge with a number of other people
Hmm.
or entities? Like how do you kind of conceptualize what's going on there?
Hmm. Yeah, so I think we tend to default to conceptual representations of ourselves as kind of independent from the environment. We tend to think of ourselves as kind of atomized, distinct objects, right? And like
Mm-hmm.
billiard balls, like Newtonian billiard balls. So we tend to think of ourselves that way. And um, what from a scientific perspective, you start to ask, well, what is my organism? And you realize, well, like I constantly have air flowing in me and through me, and I'm sharing that oxygen and CO2 in a constant process of respiration with my environment. And I'm eating food, which is the product of this environment, which goes through me and then, becomes the environment. And my state of, like, I'm not maybe even the same person I was like 30 seconds ago, right? I identify that as myself, but like my state of mind when I walked through the door like 15 minutes ago might be completely different than I am now. And so, yeah, we just tend to adopt, you know, we tend to think of like a sound as something that exists in the environment separate from ourselves. But in fact, what a sound is the interaction of our eardrums with vibrations in the air. So in a sense, we create the sound. It's not like the sound is out there and we hear it. It's actually like sound is the interaction of our sensory apparatus with vibrations, right? Vision is the interaction of electromagnetic radiation with our senses. So in a certain sense, look at the sun, it is shining is the wrong way to say it. It's actually like I am shining the sun by looking at it, right? Like I am actually shining the sun because light is the interaction of my sensory apparatus with radiation, right? And so there's
Mm-hmm.
no light if I don't have eyes, right? And so when you get into this level of description of things on a very granular level, what you realize is that like what you are is a field of awareness, right? You are
Mm.
actually a continuous field of awareness, right? It's kind of in a continuous interaction with everything around you. And a lot of, but what we tend to think of ourselves is as separate, isolated objects. And we tend to just forget this fact that we are in this continuous field of interaction. And so a lot of the, so like a very simple way in VR to like break that illusion, or at least let us just think about things from a different perspective is, well, instead of making my boundaries like hard boundaries, like I'm used to see, like imagining myself, I'll just like make my boundaries and the bodies of the other people in this environment like luminous and blurry. So there is no like clear boundedness where they end, right? They like kind of just dissolve out. And then what that means is when I
Mm.
come into proximity with other people, there's this like gentle intermingling. And bizarrely, there's like psychosomatic, you can feel this psychosomatically. Like when people do this experience we designed, we call it energetic coalescence, where your bodies can literally completely merge with the bodies of others. It's like we we repeatedly have people telling us that they had a sort of psychosomatic sensation associated with this, that they could feel it. um, and I think the reason they can feel is because we have this thing that sometimes people talk about, um, our brain creates a sense of space around us. um,
Mm.
there's a name for this which I forget about. Let me just look up what the name of it is. I learned about this recently. The Yeah, it's just the idea of what I think is called peripersonal space, which is it's a kind of yeah, it's like the envelope in which our body moves. It's like our sort of field that our brain creates around us. And
Mm.
when you have this sense of something entering that space in VR, you immediately go like, oh, like this isn't right. You feel it, and then you kind of just like relax into it. And then you realize like, oh, like I'm not bounded in this environment in the normal way that I'm bounded, that I think about myself. And so we've had yeah, a number of people report that experience of energetic coalescence to be really profound for them. And so like
Mm.
energetic bodies, like two waves, they can combine in a graceful way. Two billiard balls will smash together and then go the opposite direction, but two waves just kind of gently merge and then go through one another. There's this continuity. And so I think, what we're looking at is we're just looking at really kind of easy ways to like flip the metaphor for how we think about ourselves, really. And this is what psychedelics do, right? Like psychedelics give you a temporary way to, if you want to, like change the metaphor for how you think about yourself in relation to other things. Like they don't always do that, right? But sometimes they do that, and they, can be curated to guide that kind of an experience. And part of their potency for people arises from that. And so I think, what we try to do with VR isn't necessarily like one thing a lot of people do with VR is just like give people pretty visuals. You could do that, and that's a nice thing to do, but like we're working more with metaphors of embodiment. Like, how do I give you a new kind of body in there and give other people a new kind of body, and then enable forms of interaction that are only possible in that world? And that's a
Mm.
crucial thing, right? Like, there is no way, Joe, if I'm in a party with you, that I can merge with you in a continuous way so that we are literally standing on the same spot, right? Like, there's no way we could
Right.
do that. I mean, people, when people are like sexually intimate with one another, there's an attempt to do that, but they're ultimately bounded. And so it's really like what one of the things that got me really excited about VR was how do you enable like a new class of experience, like a thing that I
Mm.
can only have a sensation that I can do in there. And that for me feels like a really exciting use of the technology to enable a new kind of experience I can't have in any other way apart from in this environment. And so a lot of what we have done in VR is around challenging notions of, well, where do you end and where does another person start, and what are the limits of your what are the limits of your luminosity, and how far out does it go, and do you really just end at this boundary that you normally associate with yourself? And just yeah, really just using visual ways for people to embody these ideas about reimagining themselves, that are, because they're visual, they don't need to be explained with a whole bunch of words. You can just put people in there and they see it and they intuit it. And so for me, that's actually like quite an important design philosophy of the Intangible Realities Laboratory, is to use technology, to use the affordances of the technology to enable kinds of experience that are only possible with the technology. So like
Mm.
I can't normally reach out with my hands and touch the physics of a molecule as it's vibrating in real time. But now I can have a VR system that lets me do that. Like I can't normally have the experience of merging with four people simultaneously that are like in a luminous form, but I can do that with VR. And so for me, that's like really the really exciting stuff. Because another way to use VR is to just kind of simulate what already exists. And that's what
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people are doing, is like, let's make a classroom, or like let's make a forest and whatever. Like there's space for doing that, and sometimes that's a useful thing to
Mm-hmm.
do in an educational context or whatever. But what gets in our lab, what we really try to do is ask this question of like, well, what unique affordances of this technology let us have an experience that can only be had in that kind of an environment.
Mm. What I'm loving about what I'm hearing you say is, in part, you're like, through your understanding and your work with art and your work with VR, you're actually kind of pushing things more towards a um a more realistic view of what we are, who we are, and like our um, perception apparatus being, yeah, like this analogy of I am shining the sun versus like the
Mhm.
sun is shining on me and I'm seeing the sun. Well, you're seeing this visual representation. It's fabricated. Same with hearing. Same with all
Mhm.
your other sense stuff, right? And um, like being able to perceive like that kind of allows us a little more truth. And also, I'm I'm also kind of hearing us move towards some sort of like post mechanistic frame a little bit, like not very like hard, pushing it super hard, but also
Mhm.
you're like there is this other reality that's more fundamental than
Mhm.
billiard balls hitting each other and causation happening that way, right? And
Mhm.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's more fundamental. I would say it's just another description that's available. So in quantum mechanics, when it's still unresolved, like in quantum mechanics, how can I describe light as a photon of like a particle of light, and how can on one hand, and then I can describe it as a wave, and like there's are literally two theories, two ways of description that just coexist, and sometimes use one and sometimes use the other. And Niels Bohr is a famous physicist. He called this complementarity, which kind
Mm-hmm.
of just like, well, yeah, you don't have a single unified picture of how things are. You have different ways of describing things. So the important thing is don't get attached to any particular theoretical description, because like it's not the final word. And I, on a deep level, that's why I think a lot of the efforts toward like grand unified field theories are kind of just trying to like recapitulate the theistic project of like the all-powerful God who like governs the whole universe. Is like, well, no, like what if it's just not like that? There's just a suite of theories. They're not all completely compatible with each other, but like you
Mm-hmm.
pick out ones that work and ones that don't, and like you can't get attached to any one of them because none of them's actually the final word, right? um and so yeah, I don't know if you call that post mechanistic or not, but definitely like maybe like infinite shades of complementarity would be a way of talking
I've been
about it.
kind of calling it model fluidity and model agnosticism lately, kind
Mm,
of based on Robert Anton Wilson's work, because
hmm.
you're right. Like, no, there is no easy grand unified theory yet that like helps us. But,
Hmm.
we are seeing limitations when we're existing purely in the mechanistic frame, or like,
Mm,
the new agers who are trying to exist purely in the quantum frame, right? Like they're kind of not doing it right often. Um, and we'll see things like spiritual bypassing there, or on the other
hmm.
hand we'll see things like environmental degradation on the other. And then
Hmm.
it's like it's a dance, right? And I love
Hmm.
this idea of being able to flip through models and helping people be a little bit more model fluid.
Mm.
So what is the most appropriate model for a scenario, or models
Yeah,
for a scenario?
yeah. And that, yeah, I mean that kind of maybe rounds off our discussion a bit where we started, where we were talking about these technologies of like contemplative technologies, psychedelic technologies, and virtual reality technologies, where I said people get quite precious about their models, but actually, like in a more model fluid way of perceiving, like it doesn't have to be that one is more fundamental than the other. There's a VR scientist guy called Mel Slater who's done a lot of really great neuroscience on VR over the years, and he has a really
Mm,
nice way of thinking about um, immersive technologies, which
mm,
is that um, the way to think about immersive technologies. And by the way, I consider psychedelics to be a kind of immersive technology. I consider contemplative stuff to be a kind of immersive technology. I think they're all different kinds of immersive technologies. And he has a really interesting way of thinking about a hierarchy. Like if you have different immersive technologies, how would you like rank them? And
Mm.
he's proposed that one way of thinking about it is to ask the right question to ask isn't which is better or which is worse, but is to ask which of these technologies is able to um, simulate the other ones.
Hmm.
So like thinking about it as like, yeah, immersive potential, right? So for example, if I have like a phone, or this is a certain kind of technology that's limited to a 2D interface. Now, in principle, if I had a really good VR headset, I could put it on and I could have a simulated phone in VR. So in principle, that form of technology could simulate something like a phone, right?
Hmm.
Now, obviously, there's a whole bunch of practical, technical challenges, but the thought experiment is, in principle, which form of a technology could simulate another technology. And I haven't quite worked it out, like for how it would relate in this schema of contemplative technology, like psychedelic technology and virtual reality technology. But I am more and more coming around to this idea that, and I was talking with Chris Timmerman about this recently. Thinking about psychedelics as a kind of virtual reality technology, actually, like they are offering a kind of virtual reality technology. And if you take that idea to like a limit, trying to understand like, well, where do you end up, right? Is it gives you has a finite duration. It gives you like a set of perceptual um, access to a perceptual domain that is like not typical day-to-day waking phenomenology. It leaves you with like tangible residues, perceptual residues that lead to the memories that you have after the fact. Um, we've shown that in our work, because our work is only minimally representational, we don't like blast you with a whole bunch of content. And that's actually quite intentional. We do that because we want to leave space for like endogenous content to come up that you can project meaning onto the space so that we're not feeding you all the content. So the way that we do VR and the new metallic aesthetic, and it allows like internal content to come up, which psychedelics also permit, right? Um, and so, yeah, I've been more and more interested in exploring this idea of kind of, you know, microprocessor based virtual reality and psychedelic based virtual reality is kind of like understanding that. Yeah, I haven't fully fleshed it out, but I've been thinking more about like how, what is that continuum of virtuality that kind of links those two technologies.
Have you bumped into Gallimore's work on like world building and are you familiar with him at all, Andrew Gallimore?
I know about him. I haven't, and I know about the world building stuff, but
Yeah, no
I'm not
worries.
like
It
fluent with
may or
it.
may not be worth a
Yeah.
combo. He's super interesting and has a number of these things kind of like
Hmm.
modeled. I don't know how completely because I'm not a
Hmm.
neuroscientist, but
Hmm.
his what was it called? I think alien information theory kind of talks about this kind of world building concept with different substances and like
Okay.
fascinating. And I think at least coming at this topic from a somewhat similar direction.
Okay. I should check it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Well, what did we perhaps miss that you'd love for folks to know about?
Um, what to say? Um, I think we more or less have. Um, I mean, I know that um, one thing that we've talked about earlier is what happens if you combine the two technologies of
Mm, yeah, let's
virtual,
touch
you
that.
know. microprocessor based virtual reality with psychedelic virtual reality. um, and that's an area where we've done a bit of work, observational work. When we open sourced so the first few ISNES papers that we published, the code was all available open source, and then we people started reading the papers and started doing these experiments, and so worked with some of the guys at Imperial under their psychedelic ceremony protocol to go observe some of this and see what was happening. And yeah, that was extremely interesting stuff. Definitely found like one of the most interesting things that came out of that, from kind of interviewing people after it happened and seeing what happened. I mean, there's a lot there, and we're in the process of writing that up right now into a paper. But
Ooh.
one of the things we saw was that many people reported that they felt like they were tripping hard before they put the headset on. And I should say they were always experiencing the the pneumodelic aesthetic, where you see yourself as a luminous, diffuse energy body, because that's what we open source. So that was what was available. So a lot of people had reported that they felt like they were tripping quite hard before they put the headset on. They felt like they were tripping quite hard after they took the headset off, but during the time whilst they were in the pneumodelic VR, they felt like the intensity of the trip diminished quite significantly. So this
Mm.
is a really interesting question. Like, why would people be reporting this? Because on the one hand, you might think that, well, if we publish these papers showing that this environment has psychedelic-like effects, then if you add psychedelics to that mix, then maybe it would be like an amplified experience. But instead, it seemed to go the other direction for many people. So really interesting question. One of the ideas as to why that happened is potentially comes from predictive coding, which is one of the models
Hmm.
of how people have proposed how psychedelics work. So the idea in predictive coding is that your brain is constantly trying to minimize prediction error. It's projecting a model onto the world, and it's trying to minimize the prediction error that of the projected model with the incoming sensory data. Okay, and that like what Robbins proposed is that, well, maybe what the psychedelics do is they de-rigidify the model that you're projecting onto the world, and so the
Mm.
psychedelic experience is this model being kind of de-rigidified, and then other data kind of slipping through the cracks. It's the idea.
Hmm.
um, and so if you take that as an explanatory frame for the psychedelic experience, then it's potentially maybe the reason people didn't feel like they were tripping when they were in pneumodelic VR is because um, they don't have a pre-existing model for that world, because they're not, so they're all, in a sense, what I'm saying is they're already in a state of presence because they don't
Mm.
have a model for that world, because the model is basically strong expectations for what happens in that world. So we have that for the conventional world that we live in. Like, we have strong predictions for like how things will happen and what they look like and what expected behaviors are. In a pneumodelic VR environment, if I put you in there, you don't have a strong prediction for that world. And so maybe you're already in a state of presence and receptive to the incoming sensory data. And so in a sense, there's no pre-existing strong model that the trip has to kind of dissolve, right? So that's one idea, which is super fascinating, right? And so there's actually a really cool experiment that could be done, which would be, so this, if that hypothesis is correct, then that would suggest that if people were in VR environments that they did have a strong model for, so just like, I don't know, nature videos or something, then they would still feel like they were tripping in VR. But if they give
Mm,
them an environment where they don't have a strong pre-existing model for that environment, they might not feel like they're tripping. And so that's like a cool, potentially cool psychophysics experiment that could be done. Which who knows? Once we get around to writing up this paper, maybe we'll get around to doing that experiment at some point. But it also suggests that if VR does dampen the effect of the trip in that way, then potentially it's a technology that could be used to help people out if they're really struggling, actually, right? Like
mm.
to dial it back a bit, right? Put them into a VR situation if someone's having a very challenging time, put them into some sort of pneumodelic VR, and that would potentially, you know, decrease their levels of anxiety or whatever they're experiencing in the moment. So I don't know, interesting
I
ongoing
like
stuff.
that quite a bit. And yeah, I what I've found is that if you shift your environment substantially, your experience should substantially shift as well. So I think
Hmm.
there's some interesting stuff there. So inputs can,
Hmm.
play a strong part, obviously. So
Yeah,
yeah, I would love to see that. And I wonder about like the information rich aspect of some VR platforms versus like what you're talking about is like the
yeah,
more minimalistic input, and how that could have a major impact on how the experience plays out. It's fascinating.
yeah, absolutely. No, I think there's a whole bunch of interesting things to look at there. We're just scratching the surface, which is why I'm interested in understanding this continuum of virtual reality technologies, right?
Mm, yeah, cool. All right. Well, where can people find your work online?
Um, I have like a personal website, which is like my art portfolio website. It's www.glow-wacky.com. It's like just my personal website with my publications. And then the laboratory has a website. The Intangible Realities Laboratory has a website. It's www.theirl.org. That's kind of a repository of what the lab is working on. I'm not so active on social media. I have an Instagram account. It's dr.glowacki. I'm not very active on it though. But yeah, those are a few ways. Most of what we publish is all openly accessible and openly available if people are interested. And a lot of the software that the lab makes is all pretty much all open source these days. So yeah.
Great. I love that. All right. Well, David Glowacki, thank you so much for joining us. And I really hope we can do more in the future. And just excited to see where this all goes for you and your lab.
Thanks a lot, Joe. It was really good to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks.